The sun baked the desert, and the hedgerows alike. But the danger was the same. A slab of hardened steel rolling toward you on treads. Between 1939 and early 1942, Allied infantry kept learning the same terrible lesson on battlefield after battlefield. When German tanks arrived, they usually arrived with more protection than any shoulder-fired weapon could reliably defeat. The Panzer III and Panzer IV had been steadily upgraded since the opening campaigns, and by 1942 many frontline Panzer IVs carried glacis plates about 80 mm thick. The heavy Tiger I that followed into service had frontal armor rated at roughly 100 mm. Those numbers were not abstract. They were a wall between a man with a rifle and the men inside a tank. Allied infantry carried into combat only a brittle assortment of inadequate tools. Britain's Boy's anti-tank rifle, a large two-man weapon that weighed roughly as much as two soldiers' kit, could only punch about 20-25 mm of penetration under ideal laboratory conditions. And those ideal conditions never existed in the chaos of combat. The U.S. had nothing better initially than the 50 cal Browning in an infantry role, effective against light vehicles and soft-skinned trucks. It was little more than a nuisance to a Panzer IV or Tiger. Small, improvised devices, sticky bombs, satchel charges, desperate grenades, asked soldiers to run into a machine gun's field of fire and hope. The physics were brutal. Infantry were bringing 20 mm penetration to an 80 mm fight. The result: entire companies were shredded, defensive lines collapsed, and commanders demanded a portable, reliable way to kill tanks. This strategic gap is the immediate problem that drives the rest of our story. By 1941, the tactical doctrine gap had become obvious. German armored tactics stressed combined arms, tanks operating with infantry and artillery, all coordinated to exploit breakthroughs. That meant a lone platoon of soldiers could not simply wait for friendly armor. By the time their own tanks arrived, the enemy panzers often had already won the day. What commanders needed was simple and terrifyingly difficult. A weapon a young private could carry on his shoulder, aim, fire, and, crucially, rely on to kill a modern tank from a few dozen yards. Engineering theory offered a candidate, the shaped charge warhead. In the hands of a functioning delivery system, a shaped charge could focus an explosive's energy into a jet, capable of slicing through inches of homogeneous armor. But the delivery system was the bottleneck. Enter two Army engineers at the Aberdeen and Indian Head Ordnance Complex, Captain Leslie A. Skinner and Lieutenant, later Colonel, Edward Ohl. Skinner had been experimenting with rockets and shaped charges for years. In 1940-41, he and his team began pairing a small hollow charge warhead with rocket propulsion to avoid the recoil and range limits of rifle grenades. Edward Ohl, pragmatic, inventive, and working under Skinner's direction, turned a scrap steel tube and a shaped charge into a crude, shoulder-fired launcher. It was ugly, improvised, and deeply promising. The simple tube protected the operator from motor blast, allowed the rocket to exit forward, and provided a means to aim. In May 1942, Skinner and Ohl demonstrated their prototype at Aberdeen. The launcher scored hits on moving tanks in a competitive trial that other devices could not match. The ordnance leadership took notice. The weapon's nickname, Bazooka, came later, after an amused general likened the tube to a comedian's musical contraption. The new launcher was rushed into production as the M1 rocket launcher and began to reach units in late 1942. Official adoption removed the anti-tank rifle from the frontline inventory. The Army hoped the Bazooka's shaped charge rockets would be the field answer. The theory was sound. The M6A1 heat rocket could, under ideal conditions, penetrate several inches of steel, far more than any kinetic rifle round the infantry possessed. But practice is where high-order mathematics meets mud and wind. Early field reports and tests showed a deeply worrying problem. The smooth-bored tube delivered rockets that sometimes tumbled, sometimes yawed, and often struck armor at oblique angles. Even when a rocket detonated, a crooked impact ruined the shaped charge jet's formation and dramatically reduced penetration. Accuracy and reliable nose-first impacts were the real challenge. Compounding the problem was human cost. A Bazooka team got maybe 1 or 2 shots at a target before the tank's coaxial machine guns and turret crew picked them off. If the first shot missed, or the shaped charge failed to form correctly, the team had a very short time to survive. Field feedback from North Africa, early 1943, and other theaters was blunt and repeated. The launcher could work spectacularly, but too often it didn't. The ordnance community faced a stark choice. Accept a weapon that sometimes saved lives but often did not, or iterate the design until the infantry could rely on it under combat conditions. That iteration would come, unexpectedly, from 2 directions. One was incremental improvements to sights, optics, and ergonomics that made aiming easier. The other was a seemingly reckless engineering suggestion from civilian specialists and foreign-trained designers who understood both shaped charges and gyroscopic stability. What if the launcher's tube itself imparted a spin to the rocket? Rifling, grooves cut into the interior of a barrel, had stabilized bullets for centuries. Nobody in the ordnance bureaucracy thought to combine rifling with a rocket motor-driven projectile. The conventional wisdom argued it was dangerous. A spinning rocket, critics said, might fight its own motor, tumble unpredictably, or even detonate inside the tube. Changing the launch tubes in production would also be expensive and logistically painful. Yet the physics suggested a different story. Moderate spin, properly engineered, could keep the rocket nose forward, guarantee near-perpendicular impacts, and let shaped charge jets form correctly every time. The debate set the stage for one of the small, decisive technical pivots of WW2. The technical breakthrough that would rescue Allied infantry came from an unlikely confluence of minds. A Swiss-born shaped charge pioneer, a pair of young U.S. Army engineers, and a stubborn civilian ordnance consultant who refused to accept good enough. Each pushed against military conservatism in its own way, and together they rewrote what a soldier could carry on his shoulder. The shaped charge itself was not brand new in 1942. European researchers had been exploring hollow charge liners and their dramatic penetration effects through the 1930s. Among them was Swiss engineer Hans Mohaupt, who experimented with aligned charges before the war and demonstrated practical shaped charge grenades to European and later American ordnance officers. Mohaupt's early demonstrations and patents helped convince Allied engineers that a compact hollow charge could, if delivered correctly, defeat inches of armor that were otherwise impervious to kinetic rifle rounds. But a shaped charge needs 2 things: a warhead with the correct liner geometry, and a delivery system that puts that warhead nose first into armor at a near-perpendicular angle. For the U.S. effort, the delivery problem fell to Captain Leslie A. Skinner and Lieutenant Edward A. Uhl at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Skinner had worked on shaped charges and rocket programs. Uhl, young and practical, cobbled together a launcher of sheet metal a wooden shoulder stock, and a tin can simplicity that belied its potential. In May 1942, during a competitive trial at Aberdeen, their crude launcher, armed with a rocket-propelled shaped charge, was the only device to reliably hit a moving tank target. That demonstration pushed the Army to order prototypes and begin production of what would become the M1 rocket launcher. Production and early combat use exposed a harsh truth. The M1 concept worked, sometimes brilliantly, but was unreliable in the field. The problem was not the warhead's ability to form a lethal jet. In static, controlled conditions, the shaped charge could penetrate several inches of steel. The problem was orientation and stability. Rockets launched from a smoothbore tube were subject to tiny manufacturing inconsistencies in the motor, wind gusts, and asymmetric thrust. Any small yaw or tumble at impact spoiled the shaped charge jet's geometry, and penetration plummeted. Field reports from North Africa and early encounters in 1943 found that the launcher's hit and reliable penetration rates were too low for the life-and-death expectations placed on a Bazooka team. Soldiers needed the launcher to be a dependable, first-shot solution, not a hope. That distinction, hope versus reliability, is where a single engineering idea made the difference. A civilian consultant and shaped charge expert familiar with the science of liners suggested an apparently radical fix. Rifle the launch tube. Rifling, cutting shallow spiral grooves into a barrel, had stabilized bullets for centuries by imparting spin and gyroscopic stiffness. The conventional wisdom in the ordnance bureaucracy rejected the idea for rockets. Rifling a tube would spin the projectile while its motor burned, critics argued, creating unpredictable centrifugal forces and possibly destabilizing the sensitive warhead. Worse, the U.S. was already producing thousands of M1 tubes, retooling factories to cut spiral grooves into every launcher promised delay and expense at a time when men in the field were still dying under German armor. Mohaupt's deeper insight, and the data a few engineers produced to back it up, changed minds. Moderate spin would not rip the shaped charge apart. Instead, when carefully matched to the rocket's burn time and flight duration, spin could stabilize the rocket's attitude, keeping its nose pointed forward through flight. A nose-forward impact maximized the shaped charge jet's coherence, producing repeatable, perpendicular jet formation and therefore consistent penetration. In other words, rifling promised not a marginal improvement, but a systemic conversion of the bazooka from a hope weapon into a dependable AT tool. Aberdeen Proving Ground became the laboratory for this hypothesis. Engineers manufactured prototype tubes with shallow helical grooves and test-fired them against captured German armor plates and standardized steel witness blocks. The results were striking. Rockets from the rifled tubes showed dramatically improved flight stability, delivered more perpendicular impacts, and produced deeper, far more consistent penetrations in backing clay and armor specimens. Where the smoothbore launches sometimes tumbled or struck obliquely, the rifled projectiles tended to fly true. The ordnance officers, watching measured penetrations and the repeatability of results, understood that the problem had moved from maybe to solvable. The decision that followed was consequential and urgent. Army leadership authorized retrofitting production runs and modifying existing tubes where possible. New launchers would be manufactured with rifling built in, and engineering teams developed field kits and conversion processes for units already issued with smoothbore M1s. At the same time, incremental improvements arrived. better electrical firing systems, simplified stocks, and improved sights. But rifling had shifted the weapon's core capability. What had been a crude, improvised weapon was becoming a doctrinal tool around which infantry anti-armor tactics could be built. The human impact was immediate. The first units to receive improved, rifled launchers reported that the weapon's psychology changed as quickly as its ballistics did. Bazooka crews no longer fired and hoped. They trained to engage targets at realistic combat ranges with confidence. After months of catastrophic encounters with German armor in 1942 and early 1943, Allied infantry finally had a portable weapon that could be counted on to stop Panzers at tactical ranges in many circumstances. That change didn't make tanks obsolete. It didn't need to. But it returned space and time to the infantrymen, where earlier the arrival of German armor meant near certain disintegration of a defensive position. The presence of a reliable shoulder-fired heat launcher meant that with proper concealment, positioning, and fire discipline, a platoon could contest armored approaches and even blunt a spearhead long enough for friendly armor and artillery to arrive. Global security, the long war that followed, would test and refine these ideas further. Rocket shapes were improved, fuses hardened, sighting systems modernized, and eventually larger calibers. The 3.5-inch Super Bazooka, the M20, took the rifled concept into greater lethality. But the pivot happened here. In workshops and proving grounds, in the stubborn insistence of one engineer that a spinning rocket would behave, and in the willingness of a few officers to convert a fielded weapon on the strength of measured data. The result? Infantrymen who once faced armored death with little more than courage would now carry a tool that could, with reasonable probability, end the machine that threatened them. January at Aberdeen Proving Ground was bone cold. The wind off Chesapeake Bay turned breath to vapor and made the metal of rifles sting bare hands. It was the kind of morning officers liked for a test. If a weapon worked in harsh weather, it likely would work in hell. On 28th January 1943, military engineers, ordnance officers, and a handful of civilian experts watched the most consequential comparative test of the war for infantry anti-tank weapons. 20 shots from the standard smoothbore M1 launchers, followed by 20 shots from newly built rifled prototype tubes. Each launcher fired the same shaped charge rocket at captured German armor plates and calibrated steel blocks set at 50 yards, a realistic combat distance. The result? Transformed doctrine. The smoothbore group behaved as expected and feared. Rockets flew true sometimes, veered wildly at others, and a worrying fraction struck at oblique angles or tumbled. Measured penetration depths clustered around 4 inches on average. Misses and malformed impacts were frequent enough that the system could not be called dependable. Then the rifled prototypes went to work. The spiraled grooves cut into the inner tube imparted rotation, and the rockets, rather than wobbling, flew nose first and consistently. Hit rate rose to near perfection. Penetration depths doubled. Plates rated at 8 inches of rolled homogeneous armor were pierced cleanly on multiple shots. Observers who had been skeptical left the range stunned. The rifled tube had made a hope weapon into a repeatable, reliable tool. Within days, senior ordnance officers authorized conversion programs, retrofit plans, and priority production changes. The bazooka had been reborn. Logistics moved fast and ugly. Thousands of M1 launchers were already manufactured and some had been deployed. Recalling every tube would be impossible without leaving frontline troops exposed. The compromise was triage. Ship newly manufactured tubes with rifling built in, retrofit as many in-country spares as possible, and create field modification kits for units in combat. Specialized rifling machinery was ordered for production plants. Inspection protocols and new training manuals followed. The decision was costly on paper, but the cost of delay, measured in destroyed platoons, was far higher. By spring and summer of 1943, rifled launchers began to reach combat units in meaningful numbers. Their first tests in anger came in Tunisia, where Allied forces ground the Afrika Korps back in a grinding attritional campaign. A reported engagement in April 1943 reads like a headline for change. A Bazooka crew engaged a Panzer IV at roughly 70 yards, fired once, and watched the tank burn as the crew bailed out. Where previously anti-tank weapons had been a last, desperate gambit, the rifled launcher now offered a reasonable chance of success. The psychological effect mattered as much as the technical one. Bazooka teams stopped treating themselves as expendable. They trained like assault troops with a tool that, if used correctly, worked. Italy was next. At Salerno in September 1943, and later at Anzio in January 1944, rifled launchers arrived in time to blunt armored counterattacks and reduce the effectiveness of German pockets of armor using built defenses. At Anzio, where German tanks hurled themselves against the beachhead in repeated attacks, rifled launchers gave infantry crews the ability to strike from cover at a flank or rear arc, the angles where shaped charges were most effective, and thus deny tanks the freedom of maneuver that had previously been their lifeblood. Small teams in rubble-strewn villages and foxholes used building corners and narrow streets as firing alleys, taking pot shots that now had a real probability of catastrophic effect. By June 6, 1944, the rifled Bazooka and its improved M9 family successors rode ashore with assault troops on D-Day. On the beaches, against coastal pillboxes and armored counterattacks, the shoulder-fired rocket became a multi-purpose tool, not just for tanks, but for bunkers, wire obstacles, and hardened positions. In the hedgerow fights and bocage of Normandy, where close ranges and concealment favored ambushes, rifle-stabilized rockets allowed rifle squads to contest German armor until friendly tanks and tank destroyers could arrive. During Operation Cobra later that July, Bazooka teams figured prominently in breaking German armored counterattacks and enabling the breakout that would rout much of the German front in France. The test of any infantry weapon is less a single engagement than many, repeated under pressure. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 offered both a brutal trial and a confirmation. In fog, snow, and confusion, rifled launchers were used in cities, woods, and narrow roads where heavier Allied armor was not always present. At Bastogne and other pocketed defenses, Bazooka teams helped delay German armor until reinforcements could relieve beleaguered units. Across multiple theaters, reports accumulated, kill ratios rose, first shot kills became plausible rather than lucky, and infantry doctrine adapted. Tactics evolved from get close and pray to conceal, aim for flank, fire, displace. The presence of a reliable rocket team changed command decisions. Companies could hold roads and choke points with greater confidence, knowing they possessed an organic anti-tank capability. That tactical revolution fed larger strategic effects. Where before Allied infantry needed immediate armored support to survive an organized panzer assault, they could now buy time. And in war, Buying minutes often translates into buying divisions. The rifled launcher's impact is hard to reduce to a single statistic, but its effect is visible in after-action reports. Fewer near-instant collapses under armored assault, more successful defensive standoffs, and faster recovery to offensive action where allies might otherwise have been forced into retreat. The technology continued to iterate, improved sighting systems, more stable rocket propellants, two-piece tubes for transport, and larger calibers with more powerful shaped charges. Each step increased effective range, precision, test, and lethality. By late 1943 and 1944, the Bazooka family had matured into a system that infantry could integrate into combined arms plans, rather than treat as improvisation. The story of the rifled bazooka is therefore two parallel victories: an engineering victory proved on a frozen proving ground, and a tactical victory proved in sand, rubble, and hedgerows. One required calculations, grooves, and metallurgical finesse. The other required training, doctrine, and the courage of soldiers willing to stand between a tank and its prey. Together they changed how infantry fought tanks, and by doing so, they helped close the lethal gap that had cost so many lives in the war's early years. By the summer of 1944, the rifled, improved rocket launcher family had moved from experimental curiosity to a standard tool in Allied infantry formations. On D-Day, 6th of June, 1944, men landing on Omaha and Utah carried not only rifles and grenades, but shoulder-fired rocket launchers that planners hoped would defeat coastal defenses and any armored counters that reached the beaches. In the bocage and hedgerows that followed, close ranges and ambush conditions played to the rifled launcher's strengths. When a team could expose a flank or rear at short distance, a single rocket, launched from a tube that now sent the projectile true, could immobilize or destroy a tank and save an entire platoon. The psychological shift was immediate. Crews trained to aim and expect to hit, rather than fire and pray. The launcher family continued to iterate quickly. Improvements to sights, transport, two-piece tubes for easier carriage, and rocket designs increased effective ranges and reliability through 1944. The 2.36-inch family, M1, M1A1, M9, M9A1, remained the most common, but by late 1944, U.S. ordnance had begun serious development of a larger 3.5-inch system to deal with ever heavier enemy armor. Testing and captured enemy data, including observations of German Panzer Schreck and the example of heavier Axis armor, drove the requirement. Infantry needed a man-portable launcher that could reliably defeat thicker plate at combat ranges. That requirement produced the M20 Super Bazooka, a 3.5-inch launcher whose design work began in late 1944 and whose production was accelerated after the war's end. Though the M20 was not available in large numbers during WE2, it arrived in time to shape the next major conflict. When North Korea's T-34s rolled south in June-July 1950, American units called upon the new Super Bazooka to supplement older 2.36-inch launchers. Early shipments of M20s reached Korea by mid-July 1950 and proved capable of destroying multiple Soviet-designed tanks in the hands of hurried defenders at the Pusan perimeter and other early actions. The contrast with 1942-43 was stark, where infantry once had to gamble with sticky bombs and desperate charges. They now had a portable weapon able to penetrate heavy armor when used properly. Tactically, the rifled launcher family reshaped infantry doctrine in several key ways. First, small teams of 2 to 3 soldiers were trained as organic anti-armor elements within companies. Commanders no longer relied solely on friendly tanks or divisional anti-tank assets to blunt an armored thrust. Second, engagement doctrine shifted to emphasize concealment, flank approaches, and one-shot kills at short ranges rather than head-on standoffs. Third, combined arms coordination improved. Infantry bazooka teams were now an expected part of any defensive layout and were rehearsed with supporting artillery and armor cues. These changes reduced the catastrophic collapses under armored assault that had marked early war campaigns, and they increased the time commanders could buy before armor or artillery arrived to finish the job. The weapon's cultural and institutional legacy extended beyond immediate combat outcomes. The Super Bazooka's success in Korea validated the engineering principle proven at Aberdeen in 1943. Stabilize the projectile, and the shaped charge will perform reliably. That engineering insight, the combination of a rifled launch tube, matched rocket motor characteristics, and improved warhead liners, became an organizing principle for subsequent infantry anti-armor development. Post-war designs increasingly incorporated lessons from the bazooka story. Larger calibers for deeper penetration, better sights for first-shot hits, and packaging and maintenance changes to reduce weather sensitivity of rockets and motors. The lineage runs forward through the M20 to the M20A1 to the M40, and then to larger guided and unguided systems. The M72 Law, the M47, M47A1 Dragon missile systems, and later the AT-4 family, each carrying a variant of the same idea: provide the infantrymen a credible, predictable punch in a small package. The human side of this story is plain in after-action accounts. Veterans who fought in 1943 described the moment their unit received rifled launchers as a new lease on life. Small teams that had earlier accepted anti-tank missions as almost suicidal began to report consistent first-shot kills and to teach ambush tradecraft. In Korea, soldiers who had seen Task Force Smith's desperate first encounter with North Korean armor, where outdated 36-inch rockets were largely ineffective, described relief when M20s arrived in quantity. Doctrine writers and training NCOs rewrote manuals and drills around the expectation that a bazooka team could stop a tank at tactical ranges. That change altered planning calculus. Terrain that had once been impassable without heavy armor could be defended by infantry prepared to use a rifled launcher intelligently. There are larger lessons here about military innovation. The rifled bazooka's story highlights how small, inexpensive engineering changes, guided by physics and validated by rigorous testing, can have outsized operational effects. It also shows the institutional friction that often surrounds such changes. Risk-averse procurement officers, the cost of retrofitting existing production, and the inevitable debates about whether to disrupt supply chains mid-war. The Aberdeen tests and the swift adoption decisions that followed are a case study in how data, advocacy, and urgency can converge to rescue desperate soldiers at the sharp end of combat. By the time armored warfare matured into the Cold War, shoulder-fired rockets had become an essential element of infantry arsenals worldwide. The rifled bazooka's descendants protected towns, choked armored thrusts, and allowed light infantry formations to contest tanks on their own terms. Henry Mohaupt, Leslie Skinner, Edward Ohl, and a handful of ordnance officers did not merely invent a weapon. They changed the lived calculus of frontline survival. Small teams with a tube and a rocket no longer had to hope. They could expect results. That shift cost lives less often and let commanders plan with a different confidence. In a war where steel once dominated flesh, rifling the tube help make the balance more even. When the Korean War ended in 1953, the U.S. Army's Super Bazooka had become the standard by which every shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon would be judged. It was accurate, powerful, and reliable, a weapon that made infantry relevant against armor again. But the real inheritance from the bazooka was deeper than the steel tube or the shaped charge. It was a principle. Stability equals predictability, and predictability equals survival. From the mid-1950s onward, engineers working in the United States and NATO countries carried that principle into a new generation of weapons. The M72 Law, light anti-tank weapon, developed in the early 1960s by Hesse Eastern and accepted by the U.S. Army in 1963, embodied the idea of a disposable, pre-rifled launcher. The tube came with spiral grooves molded directly into the inner walls, ensuring the rocket left the launcher spinning and stable. Each law weighed barely 5 pounds and could penetrate roughly 12 inches of armor, more than enough to destroy most Cold War-era medium tanks from the flank. During the Vietnam War, U.S. infantry and Marines carried tens of thousands of them, not only against armor, but as a bunker buster in jungle fighting. Soldiers described it as the bazooka reborn, smaller, lighter, deadlier. In the decades that followed, the engineering lineage stayed remarkably intact. The M47 Dragon, fielded in the 1970s, combined rifled tube launch stability with wire guidance. Its missile left the launcher spinning, then adjusted course through a guidance wire linked to the operator's sight. The AT-4, adopted in 1987, carried rifled grooves optimized through computer modeling, direct descendants of the spiral cut first proven at Aberdeen in 1943. The U.S. Marine Corps SMAW, shoulder-launched multi-purpose assault weapon, introduced in the 1980s, used a similar rifled principle for both anti-armor and anti-structure missions, a concept validated through decades of combat data. Every one of these systems, Law, Dragon, AT-4, SMAW, Carl Gustav, inherited the same logic. A spinning projectile keeps its promise. Whether the target was a T-62 on a desert highway or a fortified wall in Fallujah, the weapon's reliability traced directly back to the rifled bazooka's proof of concept. In modern conflicts, operators rarely think about Aberdeen or the engineers who first cut those shallow grooves into steel. But the line of descent is unbroken. The same idea spread beyond rockets. Modern recoilless rifles, such as the Swedish Carl Gustaf M3 and the American M3A1, use rifled barrels to stabilize finless projectiles and maintain accuracy at extended ranges. Even sophisticated guided missiles like the Javelin begin their flight stabilized by spin or canards that achieve the same effect. Combining the old physics with new electronics, the engineering truth that rifling brings stability still governs weapon design 8 decades later. The forgotten engineer, despite its vast influence, the man most responsible for proving rifling's benefit, never became famous. Henry Mohaupt, who returned to Switzerland after the war and continued work in explosives research, consulting occasionally for Western governments, but remaining largely out of the public eye. When he died in 1981, his obituary mentioned shape charge research, but said nothing about the Aberdeen test that validated rifled rocket launchers. The official credit went to the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. Bureaucratically safer, politically tidy, and typical of wartime innovation stories, Captain Leslie Skinner received commendations and retired as a colonel in 1956. Lieutenant Edward Ohl stayed in defense manufacturing for decades, quietly proud that the nickname Bazooka had survived him. The soldiers who carried their work into battle seldom knew those names. They knew only that when they shouldered the tube and fired, the rocket went where they aimed, and the machine in front of them stopped moving. To the men crouched in snow at Bastogne, or clinging to rubble in Anzio, or huddled in rice paddy ditches near Poussin, that was miracle enough. The physics endures. To understand why the story endures, return briefly to the physics. A shaped charge depends on precision geometry. It transforms a conical copper liner into a supersonic jet capable of punching through thick armor in microseconds. If the warhead strikes even slightly off axis, the jet disperses and loses penetration. Rifling solved that by guaranteeing perpendicular impact. The 1943 test at Aberdeen wasn't simply about accuracy. It was about controlling the conditions that make advanced physics work on a battlefield. That insight, controlling the interface between science and chaos, became a model for military engineering ever since. The bazooka's transformation from unreliable experiment to trusted tool mirrored the evolution of modern warfare itself. From improvised courage to systematic, data-driven design, legacy in doctrine, the doctrinal changes persisted long after the war. By the late 20th century, every major army structured its infantry squads around organic anti-armor capability. Instead of waiting for tanks or artillery, small units carried launchers as standard issue. The ability to threaten armor fundamentally changed how armored forces operated. Tanks no longer advanced unescorted into cities or forests without risking catastrophic losses. The rifled shoulder launcher democratized lethality. It gave ordinary soldiers power once reserved for heavy weapons. That democratization echoed through later conflicts. In Korea, it gave defenders a chance to survive T-34 assaults. In Vietnam, it allowed jungle troops to blow through fortified bunkers. In Iraq and Afghanistan, it let small patrols disable enemy armor and breach urban defenses. From the North African desert to Middle Eastern city streets, the same spiral grooves inside a launch tube kept dictating outcomes. Epilogue, the sound of the spiral. Imagine the scene that winter morning in 1943. The wind cutting across the proving ground, the frozen breath of officers in wool coats, the hum of a power generator feeding current to a firing circuit. A sergeant shoulders the rifled prototype, the tube cold against his cheek. Downrange, a square of captured German armor waits, dull gray under frost. The command rings out. The sergeant squeezes the trigger. A hiss, a flash, and a streak of smoke. The rocket flies straight, perfectly straight, and slams dead center. The armor erupts in flame. Someone in the bunker breathes a low, "My God." That was the moment when physics met necessity, and necessity won. Every spinning rocket since, every Law, AT-4, Dragon, Carl Gustav, Javelin, carries a ghost of that sound. The faint spiral hiss, that means the projectile is stable. The charge will form, and the shot will land true. The story of the rifled bazooka is not just about metal, fire, and engineering. It is about the people who refuse to accept that a soldier's courage should be wasted by poor design. It is about the idea that science applied correctly can give the infantryman a fighting chance against machines built to erase him. 8 decades after Aberdeen, the spiral still spins. In every launcher, in every new generation of infantry who lift a tube onto their shoulder, aim and trust that the rocket will fly straight.